Is this thing on? Okay, cool. So I got a text about 3 p.m. Friday, and it was from the congregation asking if I would be willing to preach at the Pell City congregation. And I said, sure. Where is that? I've only been in Birmingham area for about a year and a half, so I had to do some Google Mapsing to figure out how to get. That's where I was this morning. Alyssa and I worshiped with that congregation, and it was good to see extended family, people that I'd never met before, but it's good to be back here home with faces I'm familiar with. Go ahead and open your Bible to Genesis chapter 12. That's going to be our first text for this evening. Genesis chapter 12. So the title of this lesson, let me turn this clicker thing on. The title of the lesson entitled The Ark of Hope. And the name of this lesson comes from a song that I sung in the chorus at Fried Hardeman about 4 years ago. One of the music faculty actually wrote this in dedication to a wonderful lady who was a part of the campus community, was a donor to the college for a long time, and eventually the library building that was built there was named in her honor. And the song was originally sung at that dedication. And as I was thinking through the content of the sermon, this name just rang true to me. And I hope that by the end of our time together that you will see as well why this idea of an Ark of Hope is important. So before we dive into Genesis chapter 12, I want to first do some reflections, take a step back, and think about this past year. Our theme for this year has been about him. It's not about me, it's not about you, it's not about them, it's all about him. Yes, Adam's not, you're still getting it's all about him sermon tonight. And what we've done is we've seen that this is an idea or a concept that rings true throughout all of Scripture. When it comes to things like love, loving one another, and extending past ourselves and thinking about others better than ourselves, we do that because we realize that this life that we live, the possessions we have, the relationships that we enjoy are all meant to be viewed in context of a love and a dedication. Why do we be baptized? Why is it part of what we do? But 1 Peter 3:21 tells us that baptism is an appeal to God for a clear conscience. And what better way to show that than to admit that God, my way is not the right way. I am done rebelling. I realize and recognize that the only way for me to be good, the only way to have through your intervention. Please, Lord, take my sin, wash it away. I accept the gift that Christ sacrificed himself for, and I promise to live a life that is all about him. Right? Obedience. Come up out of that watery grave of baptism. We live our lives in obedience to God and his commandments and his ideas and what he says, not because we seek our own pride, our own fulfillments, but because we know that a relationship with him is what that demands, that obedience is a natural response to that new relationship. Evangelism, as difficult and as awkward as it can be, we continue to press forward and do it because if we are truly focused on a God that has done so much for us, if we truly make our life about him, then there's nothing else we can do except to share the amazing ways in which he has acted in our lives, the amazing sacrifice Jesus gave to us all those years ago, and to tell others that their lives will be enriched by making it all about him as well. This is what we've studied for the past year. I have no doubt that Adam is going to come back once he feels better with a couple more lessons for us, why it's important to view things through this lens. But this is something that, as I've listened for the past year, we've learned the song, we've heard the lessons, it occurred to me that this isn't a concept that's hard to grasp mentally, right? For many of us, we've been raised in the church, we've been in the church for years, the idea that our lives, that our choices, our decisions should all be based on God, it's not a really hard idea to grasp. But church, can I confess, when it comes to living that out, when it comes to internalizing that, when it comes to letting that fact that it's all about him becoming driving factor in every single action that I take, that's a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder to make it move from a mental exercise to something that dwells in our hearts. Part of the reason for that, I truly believe, is that our culture is very consumerist. Culture that makes things all about us. I think of slogans like Burger King. Burger King or way. Get our food and you can get it any way you want to. We'll mix and match it. We'll do anything you want to. Or I think back to advertisements for L'Oreal Paris that ask people for products because, ladies, you are worth it. When it comes to advertising commercials, companies spend millions and millions of dollars convincing us all that we are in control, that we should make decisions based on what we want, and that our lives are going to be enriched or emboldened or made better by partaking in their product or their service or their subscription, something or other. If we're focused on us, if we're focused on chasing our own desires, how can we truly live a life that is all about Him? Where human beings are not very good at multitasking. Study after study after study has shown that. So if we're focused, there's not a lot of room left for Him. Kind of a side-by-side concept of that is, even though we've got this consumerist society, we very much have the idea of an in crowd and an out crowd, being a part of the group, the cool out the in crowd, and then not being part of that. And to be a part of the in group, you've got to wear the latest, or ride the latest, or listen to the latest, or whatever it may be. You've got to take part in this latest trend, or this latest, or have this latest gadget, or latest thing for this. Right? Every time a new iPhone comes out, 2 years later, the new iPhone's already out, and your old iPhone is suspiciously slowed down. It's a little suspicious. Right? We're all pushing forward to get the new thing and become a part of the in crowd. And this is an area where adults and children tend to both struggle with. At least they did when I was growing up. When I was in middle school, how long was that ago? Like 8 years ago, in 2009, 2010, the big everybody was wearing was Ralph Lauren polo. I don't know if anybody else here remembers that, but Ralph Lauren polo was the thing to wear, right? Basketball players, the most charismatic kids, they are all decked out all the time in Ralph Lauren polo, and they get these massive. They have clothes with these massive logos on them, so you could see them follow that horse and jockey on the shirt. Right? To have one of those, and for me, before my mom was a teacher. She recently changed careers after being a loan officer, and then the 08 crisis hit, and that changed things a bit. So my mom became a teacher. Dad worked at a community college, and money was really tight in that time. So you can probably not everybody could afford that polo. No, not everybody could afford that Ralph Lauren polo. And there's an off-brand version called United States Polo Association, and a little bit more affordable. And the logo was just so slightly different. It had 2 horses and 2 jockeys. And looking back, that's not that much of a difference. Oh, but it was. Let me tell you, if you got caught wearing USPA in the hallway, you would be roasted up and down from homeroom to 7th period. Let me tell you, it was a big deal. Kids are mean. I say this to this day that children are mean. But if we think about the fact, if we reflect on that and realize that even some of our youngest people in our society have learned how to discriminate, have learned how to make differences and barriers between one another, we realize that in this era of unprecedented wealth and access and consumerist instant gratification culture, we face the challenge of trying to balance between the two. And it's difficult. It really is. And so I think that, it's often appropriate to spend some time looking back at stories from people who lived in a simpler time. We often suffer from the problem of having too much, and that wasn't usually the case for many of the biblical characters that we're familiar with. Many of them had to work 12, 14-hour fields just to be able to put food on their table. And it's through that perspective that I think we can learn quite a bit and realize that despite those differences, there's actually a lot of similarities, things we could take from that. So tonight, we're going to read 4 different stories. we're going to see what the mentality of the people involved in those stories was. And at the end, we're going to draw some connections and some conclusions about what it means to live a life that is all about him and what this Ark of Hope concept is that I mentioned earlier. So earlier I asked you to turn to Genesis chapter 12. That's where we're going to start reading here. And for some background, Genesis 12 is where God promised with Abram. And he says, take you and your family and go to the land that I'm going to prepare. So Abram does that early in the first verses of chapter 12. He takes his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot and his family, and they start traveling to the land of Canaan. And so we're going to pick up here in verse 10 of Genesis chapter 12. Verse 10. There was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine in the land was so severe. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "Look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' They will kill me, but let you live. Please say you're my sister, so it will go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account." Abram starts making some assumptions here. He starts assuming that, these Egyptians are going to want to kill me, that my life is now in danger, and I need to start lying to protect myself. And by the way, it's easy for us to try to judge him for this idea because in our 21st century context, the idea of murdering somebody for his wife just doesn't really make sense, right? That's not something that often happens that we see all the time. But we have to remember that this is very early in human history, and we have to be okay with the fact that this was likely a real threat to Abram. But nonetheless, he assumes that this will happen. And in this thought process, in this decision-making, Abram takes his focus off of God. The God that he moved house and home and family for in pursuit of blessings that he had not yet seen. He takes his focus off of him and instead pays attention to the threat to his life that was right in front of him. And that leads to a series of decisions that continue to spiral and spiral. Let's keep reading. Verse 13 of chapter 12 in Genesis. Verse 14, excuse me. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, so the woman was taken to Pharaoh's household. He treated Abram well because of her, and Abram acquired flocks and herds, male and female donkeys, male and female slaves, and camels. But struck Pharaoh and his house with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarai. Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, "You tell me, now here is your wife, take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. This is one of those uncomfortable stories for us, right? We're not used to seeing Abram, the patriarch, the father of many nations, make decisions like this. This is a man who made his life about him in the beginning, right? How easy was it for him to take his entire family and move to this unknown land that he had probably never seen at that point? We know this about his character, but when he makes this decision and puts his wife in a dangerous spot and profits off of it, that really makes us uncomfortable. And the fact of the matter is, the reason that it resulted in that is because Abram took his focus off of God. When he made the decision to move, his focus was on God. He said, "Yes, Lord, I'm going to based on you. I'm going to trust in your promise. I'm going to trust, be faithful to me. I'm going to move my family to the place you're going to prepare for me." But when he felt that his life was in danger, he lost focus. And this is not a reality we have to deal with often. Really deal with the idea of losing our lives or the lives of our families because of our dedication to God. But it was for Abram. And when the rubber met the road, he was focused on them and not on God. Fortunately, we see God make provision in that he and Sarai were able to escape. But still, what we learn from this is that when we take our focus off of God and we start making assumptions based on what we see in front of us, based on our circumstances, we can find ourselves in very rough situations. Moving along, we're going to skip over to Genesis chapter 15 for a second and focus in on Sarai. So, we talk about Abraham and Abram quite often, and Sarai was right along with him on this journey. I find it very interesting that the first thing we know about Sarai, introduced in Genesis 11, is that she is barren, right? She can't have children. And in her culture, this was something of shame. In the culture that she lived in, one of the primary duties of a wife was to produce an heir for her husband. And Sarai had not done that, had no ability to do that at that time. And so in Genesis 11, when we're introduced to her, that's put there front and center as a characterization of her. And now that could be because the author of Genesis wanted to make some foreshadowing for what was about to happen and the way that God was going to work. Or this was something that was very well known to everybody. But regardless, this is still something that Sarai would have carried with her as a burden. And in Genesis chapter 15, see Abram start getting stressed as well. Genesis 15, verse 1. After these events, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. So God reminds Abram of the promises that he had made back in chapter 12, and he says, don't worry, I will protect you. Your reward for following me will be very great. But Abram is stressed. Abram is anxious. Verse 2, Lord God, what can you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus? Abram continued, look, you have given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house will be my heir. Again, we lose some context here because this happened 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. But the reality is Abram is also in a tricky spot. Having no male heir to carry on his name, to carry on his line, he's faced with the extinction of his family. And he tells God, as God's trying to reassure him, I think about this and picture this in my mind. He's almost wryly smiling or maybe being sarcastic. He says, what can you do for me? One of the basic things that I need to keep my family secure, to make sure my wife is taken care of after I die. One of the things I need, I don't even have an heir. So what is it that you can truly do for me? I don't see the results of your promises coming into play. I don't see where you're going to take care of me like you have said. But God continues in verse 4. And the word of the Lord came to him, this one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, your offspring will be that numerous. He believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. God gets more specific, and he says that Abram, don't worry, heir will not be the slave in your house. It will be somebody who comes from your body, somebody who is your biological son. And if I'm Abram, I'm good. I'm happy. I'm like, yes, I've gotten confirmation. I'm going to have an heir. Everything's going to be okay. This God that spoke to me and had me move, the God that my entire life revolve around, is going to be faithful to me. He's told me he's going to take care of me. And I imagine that he gets this vision, and he wakes up in the morning, and he turns to his wife, Sarai, and says, Sarai, you're not going to believe what I heard from the Lord last night. I'm going to have a son. He's going to be my biological son. We're going to be. And Sarai's like, honey, that's fantastic. I'm so happy. He said it's going to come from my body too, right? It's going to be my biological child too, right? And then Abram trails off. Because God doesn't mention Sarai. At least in this instance, he's not yet said the child will come from Sarai. And so it's in this context that we see Sarai take her eyes off of God in Genesis chapter 16. Turn with me over there to Genesis 16. Verse 1. Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, Go to my slave. Perhaps through her, I can build a family. Similar to Abram in our previous in Genesis 12, we see Sarai start making assumptions, blaming God for her not having children, saying that the Lord is preventing me from doing this. And I imagine her as being a desperate woman, seeking to maintain her station and to do her duty in her culture to her husband and provide an heir. And she says, look, it's not happening with me. Maybe my slave will be the way that this promise will come about. And so we see this decision, this one decision, as a result of taking her eyes off of God and trying to focus on her own situation. We see this spiral into a series of unfortunate events. Let's keep reading in verse 3. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband, Abram, as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. This was not what Sarai had planned for. She was seeking to do her duty. She was seeking to leave this shame that she was likely carrying, this burden of her family not having an heir, of not having a family of her own at all. And so she makes a bad decision, a decision that comes as a result of taking her eyes off of God, her own interests, of seeking to cure her shame on her own, of trying to take control of her life and start doing the steering. And we see that as a result of that, her slave does become pregnant. Her plan worked. But as a result, her slave now views her as contemptible. Now, dynamic going on here where Hagar, as a slave, is looking down on her mistress, something that is just offensive beyond belief. And the reason for that is because in Hagar's eyes, this woman is not able to do her basic duty and provide her husband an heir, and yet I'm her slave? There's some interesting dynamics here, like I said, that we miss being, thousands of years into the future. So nevertheless, Sarai is now looked down upon, and this just tears her up inside. She's brought to the lowest of the low, and the story doesn't stop there. Verse 5 of Genesis 16. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was contemptible to her, may the Lord judge between me and you." And he replied to Sarai, "Here, your slave is in your hands. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. Again, this is something that we're not very comfortable with. That Sarai, the mother of many nations, Abraham's helpmeet, his partner, the one who bore Isaac and the generations of Israel coming through her womb, we're not comfortable with her making these decisions, with her taking her eyes off of God and letting things spiral in this way. She mistreats her slave so badly that she runs away. And thankfully, many of us know the story that Hagar calls to God, and God comforts her and tells her to go back to her mistress and cares for her and makes sure and says that Ishmael will also be a great nation, that her son will be a great nation, and she's being taken care of. But this behavior, this action, because Sarai focused on herself, we see it end in not so great a situation for her. The good news is her story doesn't end there. We're going to talk more about that here towards the end, but let's get to some happier. Let's turn over to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1. Let's look at a story of two women who make the right decision in the face of opposition. In Exodus 1, right, this is the beginning of a new book. We've turned the page on the story of Joseph and his brothers, and the people of Israel, the family, has moved to Egypt because Joseph is the second in command to Pharaoh. And we start seeing, actually, the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham start coming true. In verse 7 of Exodus 18, we're told that the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. I want to take a second and just call out that point, that Abram did not live to see the fulfillment of that promise. When God took him in chapter 15 and said, look at the stars, that's how numerous you're going to be, he didn't see the fulfillment of that. But we're able to see, because of these records kept for us, that God is faithful, that God is true to his promises. And that's one of the purposes of these stories, by the way. The Old Testament being given to us for our learning as a tutor to help us understand God and his nature. And we see in stories like Abram's that though we might not see while we're on this earth, we can trust that he is true and that he is faithful. And so we see the Israelites grow and multiply and become as numerous as the stars. But there's a regime change. There's a transition of power. And transitions of power are things that we're told are going to come. We're told that God is going to reign. He's the King of kings and the Lord of lords, that he's going to reign over every king, every government authority that is in place. But nonetheless, changes in power can change our circumstances on this earth, and that's what happens to Israel in this story. Here in verse 8 of Exodus chapter 1, a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. So what does that mean? That means Joseph's influence is no more. He has passed away. His generations are gone, and this new king comes into power. Verse 9, to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further, and when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramses as supply cities for Pharaoh, but the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with difficult labor and brick and mortar and all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. We see that Pharaoh's scared. The fact that these Hebrews, these foreign people that live within his borders, are growing so rapidly that they represent a wartime threat if conflict were to break out. So he takes steps to try to suppress them, to try to enslave them, put them to work, discourage them. But God's people continue to grow, continue to abound, continue to multiply, and Pharaoh has to continue to take more and more aggressive measures. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, the first whose name was Shiphrah, the second whose name was Puah, when you help the Hebrew women give birth, observe them as they deliver. If the child is a son, kill him, but if it's a daughter, she may live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. That is something that we don't, in this country, have to deal with. The idea of a powerful government official telling you directly, do not do what your God says. Or in their case, do something that is in harsh opposition to your people and to your God. We don't deal with that often in America. But in other countries, like China, for example, I had a friend at Freed Hardeman who, after he graduated, he participated in a program called China Now. In China Now, if you're not familiar, is a program where you go, you get a stipend, they move you to China, and you teach English to the people of China. And what's kind of secret about this operation is that it's actually an undercover mission effort. The people who are teaching English are actually there as well teaching the gospel because it's outlawed in China. In China, the ability to gather together with Christians and worship God and sing songs like we just did, to pray like we've prayed, to hear a lesson like we're doing right now, to open up his word in a public place, this is something that they don't take for granted because it's illegal. And that's the kind of environment that these two Hebrew midwives are in. And it would be very easy to look at Pharaoh and say, I'm going to make my decisions based on you, Pharaoh, and do what you've asked me to do. I'm going to betray my country and my people and my God because I want to survive and stay alive. But Shiphrah and Puah don't do that. Verse 17, the midwives, however, feared God, and not do as the king of Egypt. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this and let the boys live?" I always love this response. Verse 19, the midwives said to Pharaoh, "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them." They have directly opposed a king of a nation and continue and allow the Hebrew boys to continue to be born. They kept their focus on him, and they allowed God to direct their path. One last story. It's just a page turn away in Exodus chapter 2. In Exodus, we're told the story of Jochebed. I always forget her name. The story of Jochebed and Amram, who are later named in Exodus. And there's a story that many of us are familiar with, where Moses' mother, Jochebed, has her son, is able to hide him for 3 months. But after 3 months, she can no longer hide him. And there are lots of options probably for her that we don't see about here. She could have raised Moses as a woman to try to protect him. She could have gone and moved by country. She could have given him a relative somewhere else. But what she does is such a display of faith that I really want to spend some time on this here in a second. She takes her son, her 3-month-old son, and puts him in a basket, then takes that basket and puts it among reeds by a river. The Nile River, to be exact. I mean, how much faith do you have to have in your God to make sure that your child is cared for? And we know the story, right? In verse 5 of Exodus 2, her daughter went down to bathe at the Nile where her servant girls walked along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds, sent her slave girl, took it, opened it, and saw him, the child. And there he was, a little boy, crying. She felt sorry for him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." The sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you?" "Go," Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. Then Pharaoh said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the boy and nursed him. And the child was older, she brought him to Pharaoh, and he became her son. She named him Moses because I drew him out of the water. This is a VBS story. It's a story that we know very well, and we know how it ends. We know that Moses, because of Jochebed's faith, because of her willingness to put her 3-month-old baby into what the New King James translates to an ark of bulrushes, he was saved. Pity was taken on him, and he was raised to be an Egyptian, and was able to then lead God's people out of Egypt and become one of the most prolific prophets, one of the most important prophets in all of Scripture. These 3 women made it all about him. And they made their decisions. They trusted in their God to steer their path, to direct their life. They made their decisions based on their God. And there is some subtlety to this last story, actually. And I want to talk about that. I don't know if you've ever had this question in your mind, but I often, I came across a Twitter thread the other day, and it was explaining and talking about the difference between an ark and a boat, or an ark and a ship. I learned that the word ark, the word translated as ark, the Hebrew word, is only used in 2 contexts in the Bible. One is Noah's ark, and the other one is what we just read, the basket was placed in. So this thread went through this Hebrew scholar and said, do you know the difference between an ark and a boat, or an ark and a ship? Because they're different words. The difference in the context that we read about them is that a boat you can steer. An ark has no way of being steered by the person inside of it. So now when you think about the story of Noah's ark, that God came to him and said, hey, build this ark of gopher wood and take 2 of each animal and put them on the ark, and then take your family and seal them up inside this ark. What Noah did was he took his entire family into a wooden cage, essentially, no way of steering or navigating, and they sat in the water for 40 days because they trusted in God to provide for them. I'm mindful of Rex's invitation talk from a couple of weeks ago about the faith that is displayed and the meaning of Shabbat, of the Sabbath, and how that people to this day who abide by Judaism show that faith, that it is as important as pressing a button on an elevator. And we read in this time the amazing faith that these people had to, in Noah's case, to put their entire family right alongside some animals who could very well kill them and be in water for 40 days. Or Jochebed putting her infant son in an ark that she couldn't steer, that she didn't direct the Nile River, but she trusted that God would provide. That is an allegory for our lives. We can look at life in our country, in our nation, of choices and opportunities, and we either let those opportunities make us focus on ourselves, focus on what we want. We can try to have life our own way, or we can let our life be an ark. We can let our life be a vehicle by which God is able to act. We allow him to steer. We allow him to make the decisions. He can do his best work when we're not trying to fight him and take over. One way or another, the hope that is within us in Jesus Christ is going to affect the way that we live our life. And we've got a choice to make. We can either let our life be an ark of hope, the hope of eternity in Jesus, the hope that his sacrifice truly did give us our salvation, the hope that we will live in eternity if we will be in relationship with the God that sent him down here. We can allow that to truly change us and to have us live all about him. Or we can try to steer our own boat. We can try to take control from God and wrestle with him and move into things that we think are best for us but honestly aren't. There are several passages that I put up on the screen, and we don't have time to read through all of them now. But in Matthew 6, we read about Jesus teaching the apostles and the disciples to pray. He says, pray to God and ask for him to provide our daily bread. Put that matter in God's hands. Which we see in Matthew 6, 25 through 34 on the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, look at the birds of the sky and the flowers of the field. Not even Solomon was arrayed like these. God's eyes on the sparrow. How is he not going to take care of you? Just be anxious for where your food's going to come from. Put that into God's hands. Make your life an ark and let him steer. I'm mindful this next year is going to start a new election season. Elections don't start, it doesn't actually happen until 2024. The campaigning and the ads and the picket signs and the rallies are all going to start next year. I'm thankful for David's prayer about this that we're in right now of giving and thanksgiving and just looking at what's for us in our lives. I pray that we don't forget that season when we move into election season. Because if I'm being honest, church, what I've seen over the past few years are brethren that I know personally caring more about the rulers of this nation than the ruler of eternity. They're so focused on trying to steer their life, steer this country, steer other people, that they've lost focus and made their conversations, their social media posts, every interaction about somebody who, in the scheme of eternity, means nothing. God is in control. If I could sum this whole sermon up in one phrase, it would be the title of the slide: Let Go and Let God. The beautiful thing about the story of Abram and Sarai, those stories where we see them take their focus off of God and make questionable decisions that make us uncomfortable, the beautiful thing about those stories is that they didn't end there. All four of the people involved, except for Shiprampuah, but when you look at Jochebed and Abram and Sarai, all four of them are mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, what we commonly call the Hall of Faith. And part of the reason I think that Abram and Sarai are there is because as they continue to travel with God and learn more about him, they learn to take their hands off of the steering wheel. You've got that same opportunity tonight. Take your hand off of the steering wheel of life. To submit to God through the water grave of baptism and say, God, I submit my life to you and let you be in control. I believe that the Ark of Hope that you can turn my life into is better, has a better end, has a more fulfilling purpose than if I tried to steer and guide my life based on my own interests. We can do that here for you tonight. Maybe you've already been baptized, but you just can't get your hand off that steering wheel. You keep trying to move and guide your own life, make your own decisions, chase your own interests. Maybe you're focused on yourself or about somebody in particular or about the world and society in general. I can tell you from my own experience that that doesn't work. And Scripture is pretty clear that when we let God do his thing, Romans 8:28 says that all things will work together for good for those who are called together for his purpose. If you need help with that, this church will pray for you, and we can help you in that transition. Come, turn your life into an Ark of Hope as we stand and as we sing.